The morning was calm, almost reverent as the sun brushed the edges of Lake Michigan with gold. Chicago's Gold Coast still held its Sunday silence. Empty streets, the faint sound of waves against stone, and a city not yet awake. Justice Elijah. Washington, 62 years old, drove his silver Lexus along Lakeshore Drive, his mind wandering between memory and duty. He wore a navy suit neat as always, and on the passenger seat rested his briefcase. Inside it, a case file on police reform in Illinois. Irony, he thought, had a cruel sense of timing. He wasn't in a hurry. Sunday dinners with his daughter, Lena, were sacred rituals, one of the few things that kept him grounded amid the chaos of Washington, D.C. and court schedules. But as he turned toward the quieter stretch of the drive, a flicker of red and blue filled his rearview mirror. The sound came next, a sharp command slicing through the morning calm. Step out of the car. Right now. The voice was cold, authoritative, and brimming with suspicion. Elijah's hands tightened on the wheel. He had heard that tone before, half a century earlier on the South Side, when he was just a boy watching his father being pulled out of an old Chevrolet for fitting the description. Now, decades later, it came back, the same blade-like voice, this time aimed at him, a justice of the United States Supreme Court. He slowed to a stop. The flashing lights painted the car's interior in harsh streaks of red and blue. Elijah rolled down his window, calm, composed, his voice steady. "Good morning, officer." The young man approaching his window had that unmistakable gait, one hand resting on the holster, the other hovering near the badge. Officer Ryan Keller. His eyes darted, assessing, already judging. "License and registration," Keller barked. "Of course," Elijah replied, reaching for his wallet. But before his fingers even brushed the leather, the tone shifted. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The command cracked through the air, cold and sharp. Elijah froze, both palms open and visible. "Officer," he said gently, "I'm Justice Elijah Washington, United States Supreme Court. I have identification in my pocket." Keller's smirk was faint but cutting. "Yeah? And I'm the president. Step out of the car." For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Elijah's pulse was steady, but his heart knew what this was. Not a misunderstanding, but a ritual. The same one repeated across generations. He unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, stepping out with the composure of a man who had spent a lifetime practicing restraint. The air was cold against his face. He reached into his coat pocket and produced his leather ID holder, embossed with the gold seal of the Supreme Court. "This proves who I am," he said quietly. Keller barely looked at it. "Step back. Hands on the hood." The words were absolute. Elijah hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of humiliation settle on him like a familiar coat. He wasn't being treated as a jurist, a scholar, or a man who had once interpreted the Constitution. He was being seen as something far smaller, someone out of place. Then came the grip. Keller's hand snapped around his wrist, twisting it behind his back, forcing him forward. Metal bit into skin. Pain flashed up Elijah's arm. He winced, but his voice remained calm. "You're making a mistake," he said softly, not pleading but stating a fact. Keller leaned closer, his tone low and rough. "Then you can explain it downtown." Across the street, a young woman sat in an old Honda, eyes wide. Sophia Ramirez, 28 years old, community volunteer, activist, and survivor of another. Stopped 2 years ago by the very same officer now arresting an elderly black man. She fumbled for her phone, hands trembling. "Not again," she whispered, pressing record. The phone's lens caught everything. The flash of lights against the Lexus, the old man's calm dignity, the officer's aggression, and the faint streak of blood trailing down a dark wrist. 22 seconds. That's all it took for the world to change. Sophia uploaded the clip instantly with a simple caption, "Justice denied." Back at the scene, Keller called in backup, his voice defensive, rehearsed. "Possible suspect vehicle doesn't match registration." Elijah turned his head slightly. "Officer, this car is registered to the Washington family. My wife purchased it." Quiet, Keller snapped. You people always have an excuse. Those words, you people, hung in the air like smoke, heavier than the cuffs on Elijah's wrists. They carried the same venom his father once endured. A lifetime of progress collapsed in a sentence. The radio crackled. Another officer's voice came through. What's the stop for? Keller hesitated. Driver was moving slow, looked out of place. Out of place. That was all it took. Elijah's breath fogged in the morning air. Officer, he said softly, you're committing an unlawful stop. Keller's reply was the same arrogance that had survived generations. I decide what's lawful. He didn't notice the small red light blinking across the street. He didn't see the young woman filming, her eyes filled with both fear and fury. Within hours, that light would ignite the nation. By dusk, the video had gone viral, millions of views. Thousands of comments. The caption, "Justice denied," now echoed across every platform. News anchors interrupted broadcasts. Breaking story from Chicago tonight. Supreme Court Justice Elijah Washington detained in what appears to be a case of racial profiling. Protests began before midnight. Outside Chicago's 18th precinct, dozens gathered with candles and signs. No one is above bias. At home, Lena Washington stood before the cameras, her anger trembling in her voice. My father dedicated his life to justice, she said, and last night justice failed him. Inside the holding room, Elijah sat alone. The cuffs were gone, but their marks remained. He stared at the wall, not with rage, but with reflection. For the first time in decades, he doubted the very system he had sworn to defend. When Chief Elena Vargas entered the room, her face was pale. Sir, she whispered, this shouldn't have happened. Elijah gave a weary, almost ironic smile. Chief, it did happen. That's the point. She nodded, speechless. The truth settled between them, heavy as stone. The law wasn't blind, it was selective. Across town, Keller sat at his kitchen table, staring at his badge. His wife, Rebecca, stood in the doorway. You know who that man was, right? She asked quietly. You arrested a Supreme Court justice. Keller didn't look up. I didn't know, he muttered. He looked suspicious, driving slow, acting nervous. Rebecca crossed her arms. Suspicious? Ryan, he's 62. He was calm, polite, and you handcuffed him like a criminal. Do you even hear yourself? Keller clenched his jaw. His father's words echoed in his mind. Trust your gut. Some people just don't belong where they are. He whispered, almost to himself. He fit the pattern. That's what we're trained to see. Rebecca's voice cracked. Then maybe the pattern is the problem. Meanwhile, Sofia Ramirez's apartment buzzed with notifications. Her video, just 22 seconds long, had exploded across the internet. 1 million views overnight. Reporters calling her a hero. Others calling her a liar. Then came the threats. Fake activist. We know where you live. She scrolled, heart pounding, until she found a comment that steadied her. Thank you for recording. You gave him a voice. Sophia opened her worn journal, the same one she'd written in after being shoved to the pavement by Keller during a protest 2 years earlier. She touched the page, whispering, the same eyes, the same man. Then she closed her laptop and prayed that this time the truth wouldn't get buried. At police headquarters, Chief Vargas convened an emergency meeting. She had watched the video 3 times already. It was undeniable. The tone, the aggression, the dismissal of a badge that should have ended the encounter in seconds. Internal Affairs is opening a file, she said to the room of silent officers. I want Keller off the street until further notice. A sergeant shifted uncomfortably. Chief, the union's already calling this political. Vargas exhaled slowly. It's not politics when a man's dignity is crushed on camera. But even as she said it, she knew the storm ahead would be brutal. Outside the precinct, a crowd gathered by candlelight. Justice for Washington. Accountability now. Keller sat in his car across the street, watching their faces, tired, angry, determined. For the first time in his career, he didn't see troublemakers. He saw people. He turned on the radio. The announcer's voice cut through the static. Officer Ryan Keller, with a record of 22 stops this year, 85% involving minority drivers, now under investigation. Keller's stomach turned. That can't be right, he whispered. But it was. He had lived it. Every stop, every assumption, every silence rewarded. At home, Elijah sat in his study, surrounded by law books and quiet. Lena stood in the doorway. "They're outside, Dad," she said softly. "Reporters, protesters, everyone. What do you want to do?" He closed his eyes for a long moment before answering. "What I've always done. Listen before I speak." Outside, the crowd's chants rose faintly through the glass, echoes of marches he'd joined as a child beside his father. Back then, he'd been a boy demanding justice. Now he was a man forced to question if it had ever truly arrived. That night, the city didn't sleep. The video replayed endlessly, an old man's calm against flashing lights. The nation watched, debated, divided. Some called it another tragedy, others a misunderstanding. But beneath the noise, one image endured. The calm, blood-streaked hands of an elderly black man held high under the red and blue lights of his own city. That image would haunt Chicago for months. For Ryan Keller, it would be the night his badge grew heavier than he could bear. For Justice Elijah Washington, it would be the moment he realized that even at the highest court in the land, no title could protect a man from prejudice, and that is where the story truly begins. Morning arrived, but peace did not. Light streamed through the blinds of Justice Elijah Washington's townhouse, falling across a coffee cup that had long gone cold. His wrist ached beneath a strip of gauze, each pulse a reminder of the night before. The handcuffs, the flashing lights, the sting of humiliation. The phone buzzed, endlessly. Colleagues, reporters, even the Chief Justice had left a message, requesting a private conversation. The world had discovered what happened. Across the breakfast table, his daughter Lena watched him in silence, her expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You can't let them get away with this, Dad," she said firmly. "You were assaulted on camera. If you don't act, what hope does anyone else have?" Elijah's voice was calm, almost too calm. "Lena, if I turn this into a spectacle, it becomes about me. It stops being about what's broken." Her anger softened into pain. "You've spent 40 years defending the system," she whispered. "And last night it turned on you." He didn't answer. He simply turned his cup in his hands, watching the reflection of the morning light tremble across the surface. Like the country itself, shaken, fragile, unsure of what it had become. Outside, faint sirens drifted through the air. They sounded just like they did 50 years ago. Across the city, Officer Ryan Keller sat at his own kitchen table, staring at the report he'd written hours earlier. The words seemed foreign now. Possible suspect. Nervous behavior. Vehicle out of place. His badge lay beside the paper, its reflection distorted by the morning light. Rebecca, his wife, stood in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, her face pale. "You know who that man was, right?" she said softly. "You arrested a Supreme Court justice." Keller's voice was flat. "I didn't know." Rebecca's tone sharpened. "You didn't need to know his title to see he was a human being." He looked away. He looked suspicious. Driving slow, looking around. "I followed protocol." She shook her head. "Suspicious?" "He's 62, Ryan. He was calm, respectful. You treated him like a threat because you decided he was one." Her voice cracked slightly. "Do you hear yourself?" Keller didn't respond, but the echo of his father's voice filled the silence. "Trust your gut. Some people just don't belong where they are." He rubbed his temples.
"He fit the pattern," he muttered.
"That's what we're trained to see." Rebecca's reply came like a knife. "Then maybe the pattern is the problem." Meanwhile, on the south side, Sofia Ramirez sat in her small apartment surrounded by the chaos of virality. Her laptop was open, the phone buzzing nonstop with notifications. The video, just 22 seconds long, had exploded across every platform. 1 million views overnight. Some called her brave. Others called her a liar. Then the messages turned dark. "Fake activist. We know where you live." Her stomach twisted as she scrolled, but then she found something that steadied her. Strangers commenting, "Thank you for recording." "You gave him a voice." She opened her journal. the same one she'd kept during the protests 2 years earlier, the night Keller had pushed her to the ground during a march. She stared at his face in the video, her breath shallow. The same eyes, she whispered. The same man. For a long moment she sat motionless. Then, with trembling fingers, she wrote one line in her journal: "The truth is dangerous, but silence kills it." At police headquarters, Chief Elena Vargas called an emergency meeting. Her expression was grim, her voice measured. "I've watched the video 3 times, she began. There's no ambiguity. The officer's conduct was aggressive, unnecessary, and dismissive of a federal ID. A dozen officers sat around the table, silent. Internal Affairs is opening a file," she continued. "Officer Keller is to be placed on administrative leave effective immediately." One sergeant shifted uneasily. "Chief, the union's already calling this a political stunt." "They'll fight back," Vargas exhaled. "It's not politics when a man's dignity is crushed on camera." Even as she said it, she knew the storm ahead would test everything she stood for. By afternoon, the protests had grown. Outside the precinct, a crowd gathered with candles and signs. Justice for Washington. Accountability now. Keller sat in his car across the street, engine off, watching. For the first time, he didn't see rioters or agitators. He saw faces, families, students, grandmothers holding signs with his name on them. The radio spoke his guilt aloud. The officer in question, Ryan Keller, has a record of 22 stops over the past year, 85% involving minority drivers. Most did not result in citations. He swallowed hard. "That can't be right," he muttered. But it was. The numbers had always been there. The problem was that no one had looked, least of all him. Back in Elijah's townhouse, the walls felt smaller than they ever had. His bookshelves overflowed with decades of rulings, precedents, and citations, yet none of them offered comfort. Lena stood by the window, watching the reporters outside. "They're everywhere," she murmured. "What do you want to do?" He set his cup down, his voice soft but resolute. "What I've always done. Listen before I speak." She turned to him, eyes wet. "And when you do speak, then I'll speak for more than just myself." Outside, the sound of chanting carried through the glass. He recognized it. The same chant he'd once joined as a boy marching beside his father down 79th Street. Back then, they had shouted for justice. Now, half a century later, the crowd was shouting for him. That night, the video was hacked. Sophia woke to hundreds of alerts. The version spreading now was distorted, cut to make it appear as though Elijah had resisted arrest. The truth was being buried beneath lies. She stared at her screen in disbelief. "No," she whispered. "Not again." Within hours, anonymous accounts pushed the edited clip across social media. Comments flooded in. He reached for something. "Fake story. Stop making this about race." Sophia's phone buzzed with a call from Maya Torres, her old friend and fellow organizer. "They're twisting it," Sophia said, panic rising. "They're making it look like he fought back." "Then we fight harder," Maya replied calmly. "Bring me the original file." "We'll get it verified." Sophia hesitated. "Maya, they're threatening me." "That means they're scared," Maya said softly. "Scared of the truth you caught on camera." Sophia exhaled shakily. "Okay, let's do it." By midnight, they had re-uploaded the original footage with a new caption. "Uncut, unedited, the truth." Within an hour, it had 5 million views. The hashtag #JusticeDenied trended worldwide. The next morning, Elijah stood on the courthouse steps, his resignation letter folded neatly in his hand. Cameras clicked. Reporters shouted. But when he spoke, his voice was calm, measured, steady. "I am stepping aside temporarily," he announced. "Not because I am guilty of anything, but because the system I believe in must be examined without fear or influence." He paused, looking over the crowd. "I have always said that the law is our nation's conscience. But a conscience that ignores pain is not justice, it is silence." The applause began slowly, then swelled into a chorus of chants. No more silence, no more fear. Lena stood beside him, her eyes filled with pride and sorrow. For the first time, her father didn't look like a judge. He looked like a man bearing the weight of centuries. That afternoon, hundreds gathered in Englewood for a rally organized by Maya and Sophia. It began peacefully. Music, speeches, a moment of silence for victims of police violence. The air was electric with hope and anger intertwined. But then came the counter-protesters. They shouted insults, waved flags, hurled bottles. Tension thickened. Sophia moved through the crowd, camera in hand, heart racing. Then a familiar voice echoed through the chaos. "Stay calm." It was Elijah. He had come unannounced, standing on the protest truck, a bullhorn in hand. "We must not let anger destroy the truth we fight for." Before he could finish, something flew from the crowd, a rock. It struck him just above the temple. Gasps rippled through the street. Blood ran down his face as he stumbled. "He's hit!" Someone screamed. Officers rushed forward, forming a barrier as chaos erupted. Sophia ducked behind a car, camera still recording through tears. Her trembling hands captured the image that would define the movement. A Supreme Court justice, bleeding but unbowed, urging calm amidst a riot. By nightfall, that image was everywhere. Hours later in the hospital, Elijah sat upright in bed as doctors stitched the wound. Lena held his hand, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have gone," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "If I ask others to stand up, how can I sit down?" Chief Vargas arrived soon after, her expression grim. "Sir, we've confirmed Keller's involvement in that 2023 case. The one in Bronzeville. It's bad. There's enough to open a criminal review." Elijah's gaze sharpened. "Then do it. No exceptions, not for him, not for anyone." Vargas nodded. "There'll be backlash. The union's already threatening to pull support." Elijah closed his eyes. Let them. The truth doesn't need their approval. By evening, the nation was on edge. Televisions flickered with images of Keller and Washington side by side, two faces bound by a single defining moment. Commentators filled the air with debate. Some called it a reckoning, others a witch hunt. But beneath all the noise, something deeper stirred, a collective awareness, raw and undeniable. For the first time in decades, America wasn't just watching, it was questioning. Across Chicago, murals began appearing overnight. One showed Elijah's profile bathed in light, the words "Justice Denied" scrawled beneath. Another depicted a pair of raised, blood-streaked hands transforming into scales of justice. In living rooms, classrooms, and city halls, people argued, cried, marched. The conversation had changed. For Sophia, it meant sleepless nights but renewed purpose. For Vargas, it meant political firestorms and moral resolve. For Keller, it meant silence, days spent alone, replaying the video, hearing his own voice ordering a man of law and dignity out of his car. And for Elijah Washington, it meant transformation. He was no longer just a justice of the Supreme Court. He had become something more, an unwilling symbol of a truth too old to ignore, too powerful to silence. The night the world bled for him, something else was born in its place, a movement. The third night after the arrest, Chicago no longer slept. The air pulsed with noise, sirens, chanting, the hum of news vans stationed outside police headquarters. Every television in the city played the same footage, a Supreme Court justice handcuffed beneath flashing lights. The caption beneath it read, "Justice Elijah Washington detained. Nation demands answers." Inside her cramped apartment on the south side, Sophia Ramirez sat cross-legged on the floor, laptop open, surrounded by papers, wires, and empty coffee cups. Her phone had become a lifeline and a threat all at once, each buzz either a thank you or a death threat. Fake video. "You'll pay for this. You're a hero. Don't give up." The words blurred together. On her wall, taped between protest posters, was a single printed frame from her footage. Elijah's calm face illuminated by police lights, blood streaking his wrist. She stared at it for a long time before whispering to herself, "Don't let them bury him." Then came the message that made her heart stop. Breaking, hacked footage shows, resisting Supreme Court justice. Within minutes, the edited clip spread across social media, cut, distorted, and stripped of context. The internet swarm began to feed. Anonymous accounts accused Elijah of resisting arrest. Far-right pages called the incident media manipulation. Sophia watched it unfold with shaking hands. "No," she said aloud, tears rising. "Not again." Her phone rang. It was Maya Torres, her old friend and organizer from the marches years before. "They're twisting it, Soph," Maya said. "You knew they would." "They're saying he fought back," Sophia replied. "They're making it look like he deserved it." Maya's tone was steady but fierce. "Then we fight harder. Bring me the original file. I know a newsroom that will verify it frame by frame." Sophia hesitated. They're threatening me, Maya. Someone posted my address. That means they're scared, Maya said gently. Scared of the truth you caught on camera? Sophia closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and nodded, though no one could see her. Okay, let's make it right. That night, she re-uploaded the original video with one caption: uncut, unedited, the truth. Within an hour, it had 5 million views. The hashtag #JusticeDenied burned its way back to the top of every feed. Across town, Chief Elena Vargas sat in her office, the glow of her tablet reflecting in her tired eyes. The numbers on the screen chilled her. Missing body cam recordings, incomplete stop reports, unexplained discrepancies. 65% of all traffic stops involving minority drivers had no audio or video data attached. This isn't just one officer, she said softly. It's a system. Her deputy, Captain Hayes, shifted uncomfortably. Chief, you dig too deep and the union will eat us alive. They already called this a smear campaign. Then let them, Vargas replied. We can't afford to bury another truth. On her desk sat Keller's personnel file. 2 years of records. 22 stops, 18 minority drivers, 1 fatality. Bronzeville 2023. The report claimed, suspect resisted, body cam malfunctioned. The file was stamped unsubstantiated. Vargas rubbed her temples. Not anymore, she murmured. Ryan Keller didn't sleep. The television played on mute, showing his own face beside Elijah Washington's, the banner below screaming, "Officer involved in racial profiling scandal." His wife was gone. Rebecca had taken their son and left 2 nights ago, her parting words echoing in his mind. Maybe the pattern is the problem. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his father's old police commendation for honorable service and courage under pressure. The glass was cracked, splitting his reflection in 2. The phone rang. He ignored it. Then it rang again. Keller, he answered, voice low. This is Jamal Hayes. Keller exhaled, tense. What do you want? I need to talk, Hayes said. About the Bronzeville case. Keller froze. That was years ago. You and I both know it wasn't an accident, Hayes said quietly. That man didn't attack you. Hugh pushed him. Keller's throat tightened. You can't prove that. No, Hayes said. But Chief Vargas is looking, and I'm done covering for you. The line went dead. Keller sat in silence, heart pounding, the truth clawing its way through layers of denial. The walls of his small apartment seemed to close in. The weight of the badge, of every unchecked act, every shrug of justification pressing on his chest like a stone. He whispered to the empty room, what have I done? By dawn, the city erupted again. News trucks lined the courthouse steps. Protesters filled the sidewalks, their voices rising into the cold morning air. Justice for Washington. No one above bias. Inside his home, Elijah Washington sat at his desk surrounded by law books and silence. Every headline carried his name. Every broadcast replayed the 22 seconds that had changed everything. Lena entered quietly, holding her phone. Dad, she said, Chief Vargas just opened a formal investigation. Keller's name is everywhere. Elijah nodded slowly. An investigation won't heal what's been broken, he said. She hesitated. Are you going to step down? The question lingered like smoke. He leaned back, thoughtful. If I stay, they'll say I'm protecting myself. If I leave, maybe the truth can breathe on its own. Lena's eyes glistened. You spent your whole life fixing the system, and now it's the one that failed you. He smiled faintly. Maybe that's what it takes for people to see. Later that afternoon, in the gray corridors of the Chicago Police Department, Chief Vargas gathered her investigative team. I want everything reopened, she said. Every stop. Every file connected to Keller or his unit. One analyst raised a hand nervously. Chief, we're talking about years of data. Thousands of records. The union will block access. Then we go federal, Vargas replied. We're not stopping at appearances. For the first time in years, she felt the tide shifting, not just against one officer, but against a culture that had grown comfortable with its own blind spots. Meanwhile, on the south side, Sophia met with Maya in a tiny community office filled with the smell of printer ink and stale coffee. Posters from past protests lined the walls. Silence is complicity. No justice, no peace. Sophia handed Maya her phone. They're still spreading the fake version, she said. Everywhere I post the original, trolls flood the comments. Maya scrolled through the screen. "See this?" she said, pointing. "Metadata. The original has GPS and timestamp data. It's verifiable. The fake one doesn't. Once the press sees that, the debate's over." Sophia looked up, exhausted. "They're calling me a liar. I've been doxxed. My mom's scared." Maya reached across the table. "They only threaten people who scare them. You scare them because you have proof." Sophia nodded slowly, holding onto the words like armor. That night, she uploaded the verified footage to every major platform, attaching official metadata verification. Within hours, Justice Denied was trending again, this time unstoppable. At the same time, Chief Vargas's office received a new report. A whistleblower inside the department had confirmed Keller's prior cover-ups. The evidence included internal memos suggesting that traffic stop quotas favored high-visibility neighborhoods, a code phrase long understood to mean minority communities. Vargas slammed the file shut. "We're not dealing with a bad apple," she said. "We're dealing with a broken tree." She stared out the window, the city's skyline fading into dusk. And now the roots are showing. That evening, Elijah appeared on television for the first time since the incident. The broadcast began quietly. A single camera, a modest podium, and his familiar calm presence. "I've spent my life believing in the law," he began. "But belief without accountability is blindness. What happened to me is not unique. It is only visible because a camera happened to be there." He paused, looking directly into the lens. "How many more stories will never be recorded?" Across the nation, living rooms fell silent. For a brief, fragile moment, America listened. Ryan Keller watched the broadcast from his dark apartment. The only light came from the television. On the screen, the man he had handcuffed stood tall and composed. Keller leaned forward, elbows on his knees, unable to look away. When Elijah finished speaking, the news anchor's voice took over. "The Department of Justice is expected to open a wider investigation into systemic misconduct in Chicago's 18th precinct." Keller closed his eyes. He could hear his father again. "Don't let your guard down. Some people don't belong in nice neighborhoods," he whispered. "I belong to that lie." Outside, faint chants echoed through the streets, his name among them, swallowed by the noise of a city demanding answers. Days later, the reckoning deepened. The investigation revealed that over the past 2 years, Keller's unit had failed to record nearly a third of its traffic stops. Several body cam malfunctions occurred during incidents involving minorities. Internal Affairs had ignored the pattern. When the findings reached Chief Vargas, she didn't hesitate. "Suspend them all," she ordered, "and release the data to the press." Her deputy looked alarmed. "Chief, that'll blow the department apart." "Then maybe it's time it did," she said. The press conference that followed was short but seismic. Vargas stood behind the podium, flanked by reporters and flashing cameras. "This department has failed its citizens," she said. "Accountability begins today." The city held its breath. At home, Elijah sat by his window, the evening light casting long shadows across his study. The protests outside had quieted into candlelight vigils. His daughter Lena joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. "You started something," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, the truth started it. I just happened to stand in its way." Lena smiled sadly. "And now everyone's watching." "Then let them," he replied. "The law was meant to protect the people, not itself." Outside, the crowd began to sing, a soft, trembling chorus of voices rising through the night. Across the city, Sophia's re-uploaded video had surpassed 10 million views. The major networks had verified it, and international outlets were picking up the story. She scrolled through messages from people she'd never met, survivors of profiling, families of victims, officers who wanted change. Then a notification appeared, an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "Keep recording. They can't silence you now." She stared at it for a long moment, unsure whether to feel fear or hope. In the quiet that followed, she whispered, "They're finally seeing." For Ryan Keller, that same night marked the beginning of a collapse and something like awakening. He drove aimlessly through the city, past the same streets he once patrolled with authority. At a red light, he looked out the window and saw A mural of Elijah's face painted on a brick wall, the words beneath it glowing in spray paint, "Even justice bleeds." He couldn't look away. He parked the car and sat there until dawn, watching the city breathe without him. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like an officer. He felt like a man who'd finally run out of excuses. By the end of that week, the truth was undeniable. The Bronzeville case was reopened. Internal Affairs had corroborated the whistleblower's testimony. Federal investigators arrived in Chicago. The movement had grown beyond the city now, spreading to Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Los Angeles. News anchors called it the Washington Reckoning. For Justice Elijah Washington, the cost of truth had been blood. For Sofia Ramirez, it was fear and courage intertwined. For Chief Elena Vargas, it was standing against her own institution. And for Ryan Keller, it was the slow, painful collapse of a life built on assumptions he'd mistaken for duty. Each of them carried a piece of the storm, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the nation began to change, not through violence or politics, but through the unbearable weight of what could no longer be denied. The lie had cracked, the truth was out, and nothing, no badge, no title, no silence, could ever put it back again. The courtroom was overflowing long before the hearing began. Reporters filled every row, their pens poised like weapons. The public lined the hallways pressed against marble pillars, whispering as if witnessing the trial of a century. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but no one doubted that whatever happened within these walls would echo far beyond them. At the center sat two men whose lives had collided under the blinding flash of police lights. Justice Elijah Washington, stripped of his robe and authority, and Officer Ryan Keller, stripped of his badge and denial. For Elijah, it was not the courtroom that felt heavy. It was the silence. He had spent decades in rooms like this, presiding over arguments that defined law and morality. But never had he sat on the other side of justice. Never had he felt the raw weight of being judged. He wore a plain gray suit, no robe, no gavel, just the faint scar above his wrist where the handcuffs had bitten into flesh. Across from him, Keller sat stiffly, his face pale, hands clasped so tightly they trembled. Between them sat the ghost of one moment, 22 seconds of video that had torn open a nation. Judge Clara Nguyen entered, her demeanor calm, her authority absolute. She surveyed the room before speaking, her voice clear and even. "This proceeding is not about vengeance," she began. "It is about accountability." The words settled over the courtroom like a benediction. When she called Justice Washington to the stand, the room held its breath. Elijah rose slowly, dignity unshaken, and approached the witness table. He did not speak immediately. He let the silence breathe, as if allowing the truth itself to take its place beside him. "I took an oath," he began, his voice resonant and steady. "An oath to uphold the Constitution, to serve as a guardian of justice, and to believe that the law protects all people equally. But that night," he paused, his gaze distant, "that night, I learned what so many before me already knew. The system is only as just as the hearts of those who enforce it." Every word hung in the air like a verdict. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. The quiet pain beneath his composure carried more force than any outburst could. "This is not about me," he continued. "It's about every person who's been silenced, every case unseen, every citizen without a camera to prove their innocence. I had the privilege of being believed only because of who I am, but justice should never depend on status." A hush fell over the room. When he finished, even the sound of breathing seemed hesitant. The judge's eyes softened briefly before she nodded. "Thank you, Justice Washington." Then came the moment everyone waited for. "Officer Keller," Judge Nguyen said, "you may speak." Keller stood, his movement slow as if carrying the weight of his own shame. His voice, when it came, was rough, strained from sleepless nights and swallowed regret. "Your Honor," he began, "I made a mistake." The courtroom stirred. Cameras outside clicked as reporters transcribed every word. "On that night, I stopped a man I didn't know because I saw what I was trained to see." Keller continued. "A threat where there was none." He looked across the room at Elijah, I was wrong. His hand shook slightly as he continued. My father was a cop. He taught me to trust my instincts, to stay alert, to never let my guard down. But he also taught me something else, something I never questioned until now. He told me that some people don't belong in nice neighborhoods. Keller's voice faltered, but he didn't stop. I carried that lesson with me into every stop I made. I thought I was protecting people, but I wasn't. I was protecting a lie. The courtroom was utterly still. He turned toward Elijah, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Sir, I'm sorry. I can't take back what I did, but I can tell the truth now. Behind him, Chief Elena Vargas sat motionless, her face composed but unreadable. She'd seen hundreds of officers break under pressure, but this was something else. Not defiance, not fear. It was surrender. She rose from her seat and addressed the judge. Your Honor, the department's internal review has confirmed a pattern of behavior, she said firmly. Officer Keller's actions were not isolated. Over the past 2 years, he conducted 22 traffic stops. 18 involved minority drivers. None resulted in citations. 1 stop ended in a fatality. The body cam data was missing in 8 of those cases. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. This, she continued, is not coincidence. It is culture. Her words fell like a hammer. Elijah watched her closely, seeing in her courage the glimmer of reform he had once dreamed possible. Then came the next witness, the woman who had changed everything with a single act of courage. The clerk called her name, and Sofia Ramirez stepped forward. The room seemed to exhale at her presence. She wore no makeup, no pretense, just quiet determination. In her hands, she held the same phone that had recorded the 22 seconds that shook the country. She took the oath and sat down. Her voice was clear but soft, each word carefully chosen. 2 years ago, she began, I was stopped by Officer Keller after leaving a protest. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong. He said my taillight was out. It wasn't. He searched my car and made me stand on the sidewalk for 40 minutes. She paused, looking at Keller. I never forgot his face. The courtroom buzzed quietly. She continued. When I saw him again that night, holding that man against the car, I knew I couldn't stay silent. I filmed it because I wanted proof. Proof that this wasn't just another story people could dismiss. Her voice trembled slightly, but she steadied it. Even then, they tried to twist it. They hacked it, edited it, said it was fake. That's what happens every time someone shows the truth. She turned toward the judge. All I want is for people to see what's really there. Judge Nguyen nodded gravely. Play the video. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered. There it was again, the cold voice of authority. Step out of the car right now. The image of Elijah's calm face, the blood on his wrist, the tremor in Sophia's breath as she filmed. When the video ended, the silence was unbearable. Keller's head bowed. Even his union representative shifted uncomfortably, whispering, Don't say anything else. But Keller ignored her. No, he said quietly, rising to his feet again. It's time. He turned toward the judge. Everything she said is true. The video doesn't lie. I was taught to act this way. The system rewarded it. Promotions went to those who had the most stops, not the fairest ones. We didn't see people, we saw statistics. And the more we stopped people who looked like him, the more we were told we were doing our jobs. The murmurs grew louder. Some officers in the back shifted in discomfort. Others looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Elijah watched him, torn between sorrow and strange compassion. Redemption, he knew, rarely came clean. It came through confession, through ruin. Officer Keller, he said softly, his voice carrying through the stillness. It takes courage to admit what's broken. Now it's time to help fix it. Keller swallowed hard. I will, sir. If they let me, I will. Chief Vargas stepped forward again, her expression resolute. For the record, she said, Officer Keller is suspended pending termination and criminal review. The department will also reopen all prior cases connected to his conduct. Keller's union representative, Laura Bennett, stood abruptly. Chief, this is political theater. The officer has admitted his mistake. What more do you want? Vargas turned, her eyes sharp. Change, she replied. That's what we want. The judge took a deep breath, looking down at her notes before delivering her ruling. This court finds that Officer Ryan Keller violated constitutional rights under color of authority. His actions represent not only individual misconduct but systemic negligence. Her voice was calm, yet every word struck with precision. The court recommends immediate disciplinary action, the establishment of external oversight, and public transparency of all traffic stop data. Her gavel came down once. The sound echoed through the chamber like a reckoning. Outside, the noise of the waiting crowd swelled as the doors opened. Elijah and Lena stepped into a blinding storm of flashbulbs. The chants began almost instantly. Justice for Washington. No more silence! Microphones thrust forward. Justice Washington, what does today mean to you? Lena spoke first. This isn't victory, she said. It's acknowledgement. There's still more to do. Her father stood beside her, silent, his gaze distant. The noise washed over him like rain. For the first time since that night, he allowed himself to feel something like hope. Not triumph, but the faint beginning of healing. Later that evening, the courthouse stood nearly empty, echoing with the ghosts of the day's words. Keller walked out alone. His badge had been surrendered. His uniform was gone. The air felt lighter and heavier all at once. Across the street, a small group of protesters held candles. One sign caught his eye. Even broken men can rebuild. He stood there for a long time, not as a cop or a villain, but as a man stripped bare. The streetlights glowed softly above him, flickering against his tired eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of silence and understood it not as peace, but as consequence. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Sophia sat at her desk replaying the video one last time. She saved it onto a flash drive labeled The Truth. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the darkened screen. For the first time since that night, she smiled, not with joy, but with relief. She had kept her promise. She had shown the world what others tried to hide. She whispered to herself, "It's out there now. They can't unsee it." At home, Elijah Washington sat alone in his study. The air was still, the city's noise faint through the glass. On his desk lay a faded photograph of his father, standing tall at a civil rights march in 1972, holding a sign that read, "Justice for All." Elijah traced a finger over the image, the ink worn smooth from years of touch. "It took too long," he murmured, "but maybe now it begins." The city outside buzzed with unrest and renewal. The courtroom reckoning was over, but the true judgment, the one written not in law but in conscience, had only just begun. Across Chicago, murals glowed beneath streetlights. In classrooms, students debated justice. In precincts, silence turned to questions. And in homes, ordinary people began to see that the fight was no longer about one man's dignity. It was about the soul of a nation learning, finally, to look at itself and not turn away. The storm that followed the courtroom hearing didn't end. It evolved. The city of Chicago became the epicenter of a nationwide reckoning. News anchors, politicians, and ordinary citizens were still replaying the same 22 seconds of video that had exposed not only one officer's prejudice, but an entire system's disease. Justice Elijah Washington had been cleared of wrongdoing, but peace eluded him. Every camera turned toward him. Every headline bore his name, and every protester carried his image as a symbol of defiance. Yet he never saw himself as a martyr, only as a man who had finally been forced to see what the law had long refused to admit. By the time Congress summoned him to testify, the nation was trembling between outrage and hope. That morning, as Elijah stood before his mirror straightening his tie, Lena entered the room with a folder tucked under her arm. She looked older somehow, worn by months of protest and scrutiny, but her eyes burned with the same fierce intelligence that had always reminded him of her. "Mother, you're about to walk into a room full of people who want to bury this," she warned. "They'll try to twist your words." Elijah smiled faintly. "Then I'll remind them the truth can't be buried forever." When he arrived at the Capitol, the hallways were lined with cameras. Protesters chanted outside, "Justice for Washington, justice for all." Inside, the air was heavy with tension. The Civil Rights Committee chamber was packed, lawmakers, reporters, and citizens crowding every inch of space. Representative Aisha Khan, the chairwoman, greeted him with quiet respect. "Justice Washington, she said as he took his seat. Your experience has ignited a nationwide debate about accountability and systemic bias. We'd like to hear in your own words what you believe must change. Elijah adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the panel. For years, he began, his voice calm but resonant. I believed the law was a shield, a fair and impartial instrument. But a shield is only as strong as the hand that holds it. And when bias grips that hand, the law itself becomes a weapon. The room fell silent. What happened to me was not unique. He continued, it's part of a pattern, one I've seen buried in the data for decades. Black drivers are stopped 3 times more often than white drivers. We are searched more, cited more, and believed less. The numbers don't lie. We just refuse to listen. A few heads bowed. Others scribbled notes furiously. Representative James Whitaker, a conservative voice known for his allegiance to police unions, leaned back in his chair, unimpressed. Justice Washington, he interrupted. Surely you'd agree these are exceptions, not the rule. Our officers risk their lives daily. Perhaps your encounter was a misunderstanding. Elijah turned toward him, unflinching. A misunderstanding ends when the truth is shown, he replied. In my case, the truth was ignored until it was filmed. How many others never get that chance? The murmur that followed rippled like a wave. Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. So what do you suggest? That we punish every officer for one mistake? Elijah's voice softened but carried iron beneath the calm. I suggest we stop mistaking accountability for punishment. I respect law enforcement, Representative. But respect without oversight isn't justice, it's blind loyalty. And blind loyalty is what kills trust. The words landed like a gavel strike. Across the nation, people watching the hearing erupted in applause. Outside the chamber, protesters cheered, holding signs that read, "No more silence. No more fear." In Chicago, Chief Elena Vargas was waging a quieter war of her own. The department had split in 2, those who believed in reform and those who saw her as a traitor. Police unions organized walkouts claiming she had sided with politics over the badge. Officers slow-walked their calls in protest. Yet Vargas never faltered. At a press conference, she stood before a wall of microphones. The badge must mean integrity, she declared, not immunity. If that makes me unpopular, so be it. Her words reverberated across the nation, echoing Elijah's own. Slowly, other police chiefs began to follow her lead. Within months, the Illinois legislature passed sweeping reforms, mandatory body cameras, public access to disciplinary records, and civilian review boards with subpoena power. For the first time in decades, transparency had a pulse, but reform came at a price. Vargas faced constant threats, anonymous letters, vandalized cars, endless pressure from powerful people who wanted the world to forget. She endured it all in silence, knowing that the moment she stopped fighting, the system would swallow the progress whole. Meanwhile, Sofia Ramirez's life had changed beyond recognition. Her 22-second video had become a documentary subject, a congressional exhibit, and a rallying cry. She was invited to speak at universities, civil rights conferences, and digital ethics panels. Cameras followed her everywhere, yet fame didn't bring comfort. Some called her brave, others accused her of betrayal. Online hate followed her like a shadow. One evening, as she prepared for a televised panel, Maya Torres stopped by her apartment. You don't have to keep doing this, Maya said gently. You've already done more than anyone could ask. Sofia shook her head. I can't stop. Not while people are still calling him a criminal for surviving. During the broadcast that night, Sofia faced a panel of pundits who debated whether activist footage had too much power. She waited patiently, then spoke with quiet conviction. Justice Washington reminded us that dignity shouldn't depend on status, she said. We shouldn't need titles or cameras to be treated like human beings. The studio went silent. Then the audience erupted in applause. The clip went viral overnight. Watching from his apartment, Ryan Keller felt tears sting his eyes. She's right, he whispered. Every word. Keller's own life was in ruins, yet for the first time he had stopped running from it. Fired from the department, divorced, abandoned by his union. He lived in a small apartment with peeling wallpaper and no furniture except a table, 2 chairs, and an old television that never left the news. One afternoon, a letter arrived, a lawsuit notice from Elijah Washington's legal team, seeking $2 million in damages for unlawful detention and emotional distress. Keller stared at it for a long time, then whispered, I deserve it. But later that night, after hours of staring at his reflection in the dark window, he picked up his phone and dialed a number. When Elijah answered, his voice was calm but guarded. "Officer Keller." Keller hesitated. "You probably don't want to hear from me." "You're right," Elijah said evenly. "But I'm listening." "I have something you need to know," Keller said, his voice trembling. "The corruption, it goes deeper than me. There are others, supervisors, data clerks, officers. They've been burying cases, deleting footage, falsifying reports. They'll come after me if I talk, but I can't keep this to myself anymore." Elijah's tone sharpened. "Then tell the truth. Don't whisper it. Say it where it can't be silenced." Keller took a shaky breath. "I will." A week later, Elijah's congressional testimony made headlines across the world. He presented a 120-page report, meticulously detailed, drawn from years of rulings and Keller's insider evidence. It revealed patterns of suppression, loopholes in oversight, and the systemic erasure of accountability. Representative Aisha Khan commended his courage. "You've given us a roadmap for reform," she said. Whitaker countered, "and perhaps a blueprint for federal overreach." Elijah's reply was simple. Accountability strengthens those who serve honorably. It weakens only those who hide behind power. That quote would become legend, printed on posters, banners, and courthouse steps across the country. But courage had its consequences. Threats flooded in. Anonymous calls, letters, menacing shadows parked outside his home. One morning, Lena found a note taped to her windshield. "Stay quiet or you'll regret it." When she showed it to him, Elijah didn't flinch. "They're trying to scare us," she said through tears. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "That means we're winning." Still, he wondered, how much longer could his family bear the weight of his cause? Meanwhile, Keller's confession detonated like a second explosion. He filed a sworn affidavit detailing years of misconduct within the Chicago Police Department. 15 officers, 2 supervisors, countless falsified reports. Every headline screamed the same words. Disgraced officer turns whistleblower. Some called him brave. Others a traitor. But for the first time, his truth was louder than his past. When reporters surrounded him outside the courthouse, one shouted, "Do you regret what you did to Justice Washington?" Keller paused, the cameras flashing in his face. "Every day," he said. "That's why I'm here." The clip aired nationwide. And for a rare moment, America saw something unexpected. A man who had done wrong choosing to make it right. The dominoes fell fast after that. Chief Vargas's reforms gained traction across multiple states. Civilian oversight boards became mandatory in 10 cities. Minority stops dropped by 25%. Misconduct complaints fell by half. The movement spread far beyond Chicago. In New York, officers underwent empathy training modeled after what became known as the Washington Protocol. In Atlanta, a new community policing initiative was launched in his name. The nation was transforming. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. In Washington, Elijah returned to testify one final time. He presented Keller's affidavit as federal evidence, urging Congress to adopt the Civil Accountability and Integrity Act. "The system will not fix itself," he said. "It takes courage from those who once upheld it to admit it's broken." Whitaker, still resistant, accused him of politicizing tragedy. Elijah met his gaze and said quietly, "Politics divides us. Justice binds us. Choose which one you serve." That line, too, would live on. Within weeks, the bill cleared committee. Even the White House released a statement in support. For the first time in a generation, national reform felt possible. One evening, Elijah stepped out of the courthouse and found Ryan Keller waiting near the steps. The air was cool, the city's lights flickering across the marble columns. "I didn't expect you to come," Keller said. "I didn't come for you," Elijah replied. "I came for the truth. But it seems you finally brought it with you." Keller nodded. "I'm in a program now, teaching recruits about bias awareness. It's not much, but it's a start." Elijah regarded him for a long moment before saying, "Redemption never begins with applause. It begins in silence." Keller lowered his eyes. "Then I'm learning." They stood there for a while. Two men bound by a past that neither could erase, but perhaps, finally, could transform. That night, as Elijah sat by his window overlooking the Chicago skyline, the city hummed with an uneasy kind of peace. He thought of Sophia, whose courage had sparked a movement. Of Vargas, who'd risked her career for truth. Of Keller, who had chosen confession over comfort. Progress was fragile. But for the first time it felt real. Lena joined him, a quiet smile on her face. They passed it, she said softly. The committee approved the act. He exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his shoulders. Then maybe, he murmured. The law is starting to listen again. Outside, the lights of the city shimmered across Lake Michigan, a reflection of something new and uncertain, but alive. Justice, imperfect and unfinished, was finally moving forward. 10 months had passed since the night that changed everything. The echoes of protest chants that once shook the streets of Chicago had faded into quiet conversations in classrooms, city halls, and police academies. The anger had cooled, replaced by something rarer, reflection. The nation was still divided, still uncertain, but no longer blind. The world justice Elijah Washington saw now was not the same one that had cuffed him beneath flashing lights. That morning, he drove slowly through the same neighborhood where it had all begun, the Gold Coast, serene and sunlit. The air was cool, the lake calm, the streets lined with the same brick townhouses and towering oaks. But this time, as he approached the intersection where it had happened, he noticed a patrol car parked by the curb. The officer inside looked up, recognized him, and nodded respectfully. Elijah slowed, returning the gesture, a small thing, almost nothing, yet it carried the weight of change. A week earlier, the Civil Accountability and Integrity Act had passed through Congress by a narrow but historic margin. It was a reform decades in the making, fueled by blood, truth, and courage. Its mandates were sweeping: mandatory body cameras for all active duty officers, civilian oversight boards with subpoena power, a national misconduct database, and a federal training standard, the Washington Protocol. For the first time, empathy had been written into law. Every recruit in the country would now be required to complete bias awareness training and cultural empathy certification before earning their badge. The protocol, inspired by Elijah's ordeal, was more than policy. It was conscience institutionalized. Elijah returned to the Supreme Court quietly. There was no fanfare, no ceremony. The marble halls felt different now. Their echo reminded him not of power, but of responsibility. Each corridor carried whispers of what justice had cost him: his peace, his anonymity, and for a time his faith. He still felt the faint scar on his wrist when he rested his hand on the bench. It never fully healed, but perhaps it wasn't meant to. It was a reminder. That afternoon, Elijah visited a small community center in Englewood, rebuilt using federal reform grants from the act he'd helped inspire. Children played basketball outside while volunteers distributed books in the lobby. He moved quietly among them, unnoticed at first, until a familiar voice called from across the room. "Justice Washington?" He turned. Sophia Ramirez stood near a mural of her own making, a vibrant painting of raised hands beneath the words, "Dignity should never need a title." She looked different now. Older, steadier. A law student at the University of Chicago, her blazer a size too big, her smile wide and genuine. "You kept your promise," she said warmly. Elijah returned the smile. "No," he said. "We kept it, together." She led him toward the mural, where a framed still image hung beneath the inscription, the same 22-second moment that had changed their lives. The flash of red lights, the trembling phone, his calm, bloodied hands raised beneath the weight of injustice. "I used to hate this photo," she admitted softly. "Now I think of it as the beginning." He studied it for a moment, then nodded. Sometimes the truth has to hurt before it heals. Across the city, another transformation was taking shape. Ryan Keller stood before a classroom of cadets at the Chicago Police Academy. He no longer wore a badge, no gun, just a plain navy shirt with the Academy's logo stitched over the heart. The recruits, young, diverse, eager, watched him in silence. Most knew his story. Some feared him, others judged him. A few looked at him with cautious curiosity. He didn't flinch from it. "I'm not here to make excuses," he began. "I'm here because I was wrong." He paced slowly, eyes scanning the room. "Years ago, I saw threat where there was none. I let fear guide me instead of judgment. I believed my instincts were law." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "They weren't. They were bias handed down from generations before me, and I followed them blindly." He stopped in front of the first row, meeting the gaze of a young black recruit. "Authority doesn't make you right," he said quietly. "Decency does." The words hung in the air, heavier than any lecture. When the session ended, the recruits filed out slowly, whispering among themselves. But one young woman stayed behind. "My brother was stopped once," she said, her voice soft. "Like the man in that video." Keller's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," he said. She hesitated, then added, "You being here, it matters." For a long moment he couldn't speak. He simply nodded. He finally understood what redemption looked like. Not applause, not forgiveness, but service without expectation. Chief Elena Vargas received the quarterly reform report at her office downtown. The results were better than anyone predicted. Since the implementation of the Washington Protocol, racial disparities in traffic stops had dropped by nearly 30%. Complaints of misconduct were down by half. Community trust, for the first time in years, was rising. She leaned back in her chair, exhaustion giving way to something like relief. They weren't finished. Not by a long shot, but they were moving forward. She typed a message and sent it to one contact in her phone, simply labeled E. Washington. "We're turning the corner." "Thank you." A reply came minutes later. "Keep driving." That evening, Elijah sat in his living room surrounded by the sound of laughter. His grandchildren, Marcus Jr. and Alicia, raced through the house, leaving trails of scattered crayons and toy cars in their wake. He hadn't realized how long it had been since his home had felt alive like this. "Grandpa, what's this?" Marcus asked, pulling a thick, weathered book from the shelf. The gold lettering read, "Speeches That Changed America." Elijah smiled. "It's a book about courage," and he said, "about people who changed things when everyone said they couldn't." The boy's eyes widened. "Like you?" Elijah chuckled softly. "No, son. Like us." He opened the book and began to read, his voice low and steady. The children listened, their small faces glowing in the warm light. Outside, the wind rustled faintly against the windows. For the first time in years, it didn't sound like sirens. It sounded like peace. In Washington, D.C., Representative Aisha Khan stood before the press, cameras flashing in the marble rotunda. "This began with a single act of injustice," she said, "but it became a movement because ordinary people refused to stay silent. Justice Washington reminded us that fairness isn't a privilege, it's a duty." Behind her, banners displayed the rollout of the Civil Accountability and Integrity Act's first nationwide programs. Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, New York, each implementing oversight boards, empathy-based training, and transparent disciplinary systems. Across the country, officers and civilians stood together at new training centers named for Elijah Washington, and though resistance remained, loud, fierce, and political, the movement endured. Because now, every time another story broke, something remarkable happened. People didn't just mourn. They organized, they filmed, they demanded, they remembered. Accountability had become part of the nation's conscience. But even as change took root, reminders of the road ahead remained. New videos surfaced. Different cities, different faces. The same old mistakes. Each one reignited the pain, the protests, the debates. Yet this time the response was different. This time, people knew where to look for hope. They had seen it once before in the calm of an old man's voice saying, "You're making a mistake." They had seen it in Sophia's trembling hands holding a phone that refused to look away. They had seen it in the courage of a police chief who risked her career for truth, and in the quiet redemption of a man who chose confession over silence. The movement no longer belonged to any one of them. It belonged to everyone. That winter, the city lay beneath a blanket of snow. From the window of his townhouse, Elijah watched the flakes drift past the glass, softening the harsh edges of the skyline. Lena entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if that video never went public?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "Every day. And that's why we keep fighting," he said. "Because somewhere right now, someone's going through the same thing, and they need to know the law will stand with them, not against them." She smiled faintly. "You've done enough, Dad." He shook his head gently. "Enough would be when no one has to film their own dignity just to prove it exists." Lena reached over, squeezing his hand. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the frozen lake, their glow reflecting like stars on water. fragile, flickering and full of promise. Later that night, after the house had gone quiet, Elijah walked down the hallway and peeked into his grandchildren's room. They were asleep, dreaming, unburdened by history, their futures untouched by the fears that had haunted generations before them. He turned off the lamp and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness wash over him. Then he whispered into the dark, more to himself than anyone else, "We're not done, but we're closer than we were." The words felt like a prayer. Outside, a police cruiser rolled slowly down the street. Its siren was off, its lights dim. The officer inside glanced up at the townhouse window and saw a man standing there, calm and dignified. He didn't know who he was, not really, but he nodded anyway, a silent acknowledgement of the weight he now carried. The badge was still heavy, but now at last it was being carried by shoulders strong enough to bear the truth. And as dawn crept across the lake, the city of Chicago began to stir, a little bruised, a little weary, but awake. Justice Elijah Washington sat back in his chair, the morning light spilling across his desk, and allowed himself a rare thing, a quiet smile. For the first time in his life, the law didn't feel distant. It felt human, and that, he thought, was the beginning of everything.